Welcome to the last meeting of the semester. Well, you're not supposed to be so happy when I say that. You're supposed to say, oh, it's too bad. Just two quick things. One is I noticed for class, there are, interesting that, I don't know which class it is been looking at civil disobedience. Which class is that? Yeah, okay, so you'll see, it's actually an interesting experiment. So you'll see some students today who are taking part in what you can call acts of civil disobedience. It's one of the really important pieces of literature in our history. And if you get a chance to learn more about it, you should. The second, less important announcement is I have never seen such ugly sweaters as I've seen in the last week. Wow. So, all right. I want to talk about an idea, an idea I think that's really pressing for us now. And it's about it's a concept that I care a lot about, and it's a serious one. This won't be too long a talk, but I want to take us through the idea of what perseverance means. And you need to think about this now. I'm going to step down so I'm not in the way. What I want to do is just quickly take you through the science on what perseverance means, because it's really important for you now as you go into exams and as you go into the winter term. And there's some things that you should understand about perseverance, and I'd like to suggest that they really become consciously something you think about. You don't just discard this as, well, it's an idea here. You know, I've heard my grandparents and parents and teachers talk about it, and coaches and what have you. But that it's actually something, a skill you can develop. And I'd argue it's one of the 2 or 3 most important things I think that we try to do here. So perseverance, what does it really mean? This is a book that I read all the time. It's sort of the Bible, if you will, on characteristics. And it's by these 2 guys, Chris Peterson and Marty Seligman. And Marty Seligman's a really interesting clinical psychologist. And he's done a lot of writing. And this won't surprise you. You understand this definition. But I would say every word in it is important. The first is, obviously, persevering anywhere, Taft or anywhere, has to be voluntary. When we talk about persevering through things, it has to be something you're doing on your own. The idea of continuation is critical. Real perseverance, when we talk about it in other words like that, like persistence, you mean you have to continue it. It isn't something you do briefly and then ends. You continue no matter what. And of course, this idea that there's action involved. Thinking about persevering is not persevering. Right? Saying, I really want to persevere is not the same as taking action steps to make sure you do. And obviously, the critical idea is that persevering is continuing that action no matter what happens. Whether you fall down, whether there's setbacks, no matter what the obstacles are. That's the whole point about perseverance. And for those of you who are in AP psychology, you may know there's a long science and a lot of study over the years that's been done on perseverance. Who perseveres? Here's the good news. Anybody can. Anybody can persevere. It cuts across gender. There's studies, and it shows, and some studies suggest that boys persevere more than girls in some tasks, and some that suggest girls more than boys in others. Essentially, the data is mixed, and it says anybody can persevere. It doesn't matter what your IQ is. It doesn't matter if you're physically strong or weak. It doesn't matter which culture you come from or family upbringing, socioeconomic class. It doesn't matter. Anybody can persevere. But there are some things that suggest who's more likely to persevere. One is the obvious one. People who expect that they're going to have some payoff. There's been some interesting studies done where they rig slot machines and they investigate to see who will play longer. And people who have either won or come close to winning, imagine a slot machine with all those symbols coming down. Those who have come close to winning or have won tend to persist longer. And of course, that's the catch-22, isn't it? Well, obviously, if you've had some success, you're more likely to, and the more setbacks are, the less likely. But that's an important idea, that if you've gotten close or you've actually had the benefit, you will persist longer. The second point's vital. Every study shows this. If you're optimistic, people persist longer. Whiners, negative people, those who think that the glass is half empty, just tend not to, by any measure they use, tend not to persist as long. High self-esteem, of course, there's a catch-22 there as well. People who believe in themselves tend to persist longer than those who don't. Of course, where do you get that self-esteem? Successfully overcoming the obstacles. So those two are related. And here's an interesting point. You might think that being told the problem is not that hard will make you more likely to persist because there's a higher possibility of succeeding. The data is exactly the opposite. It says the harder you think it is, the longer you will persist. There are studies which they've done, in particular with children and teenagers, and when they give one problem and they say, it's actually not that hard, you should be able to get it, and the people studied don't persist that long. If you take that same person and say, you know what, this problem, this is going to be really, really hard, they persist longer. They say, I will need to persist longer. This is going to require more of me. That's why, by the way, a good coach doesn't say before the big game, he doesn't downplay it. He doesn't say, or she doesn't say, you know, it's not going to be that tough. I think we can do it. The good coach is saying, this is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And I won't say about exams, oh, it's not going to be that hard. You'll be fine. I think exams are going to be really hard. I'm not going to tell you it's easy. And because I'm saying it's hard, and they will be hard, and teachers are telling you you're hard, the hope is you're going to persist longer. I think it would be crazy for you to say, oh, yeah, this AP Bio, come on, it's easy. Monty, come on. Never want to do that. And then so if you see it as difficult, you're going to persist longer. And the last point is obvious. For people who see that the challenge is somehow linked to identity, there's intrinsic, that is, it's internal motivation, and it makes you more willing to do it. If you say, being an athlete's a big part of my identity, or being a singer is a big part of my identity, or being a scholar is a big part of my identity, you tend to work harder and harder for that. Now, what enables it? These kind of things. Close relationships clearly do. The data says that if you're part of a larger group or you're hearing from others that this persistence matters, it tends to increase persistence. That's what a team is. I suspect there were moments in the fall during the season or during the play where the fact that other people were with you made you want to persist. It makes, by the way, lonely persistence even more important, more impressive. Receiving positive feedback, it's a little bit mixed, actually. Yes, getting positive feedback does help, but it's also, there's evidence that says negative feedback, it works as well. So don't expect, a good coach is sometimes going to say, hey, you did a great job. But you also can be motivated to persist by someone being critical. You didn't work hard enough. We can do better than that. So the evidence is mixed. Extrinsic reward, that is reward that comes from outside, it's mixed. A lot of studies have shown that if you give a reward in advance, we are going to pay you $5 in this study if you persist. The motivation to persist will go up marginally, but if you pull that away, it goes down dramatically. If you give it sometimes but not others, it tends to go down. So extrinsic motivation is one of the least important things in getting motivated. And the last point is really interesting in my mind. If you tell someone after that setback or failure, no, let me change it. If you tell them that they succeeded because they're really smart, that actually lowers the evidence, it lowers persistence. If you see setback as an example that you didn't quite persist and work hard enough, it will increase persistence. So if you have a teacher say to you, you know what, the reason you did well was because you worked really hard, that tends to increase persistence more than the teacher who says to you, you did really well because you're really smart. That distinction is subtle, but it's very important. The benefits are obvious. Persistence leads to more persistence. You get more enjoyment out of it. If you said to yourself, I'm going to try to run below 50 seconds in the quarter, I'm going to try to jump a certain height over the pole vault, I'm going to try to get a particular grade with a teacher that I've never gotten before, you get more enjoyment when you finally get it. Another thing that happens is if you persist longer and longer at something, you develop other skills because you've been set back, it hasn't worked, you have to try new things. History of the military, by the way, is filled with examples of this. Research is filled with this, scientific research. People have tried one thing, they persisted and they couldn't get it and they had to do new things. And of course, it enhances the expectation that you can control and do it yourself. Right? They're everywhere. One of my favorite movies is Shawshank Redemption. That's a movie about, right? Isn't that a movie about persistence? If you look at, I think Tom Hanks is one of the great actors in our generation, and his movies often are about persistence. That's what Saving Private Ryan is about in some ways. That's what Castaway is about, Apollo 13, right? Literature, you've studied fictional characters who persist. Biographies, often memoirs, are about persistence. No one wants to read about someone who just gives up. Athletics and the arts, examples all over the place. People who worked really hard to get something published, right? The playwright who labored for years, the novelist who labored for years, the athlete who didn't make the team many years and finally did and trained or made the Olympics. I suspect if you thought about this, they're family stories. Certainly my family, I remember hearing stories, about my grandparents in particular, where I look at my mother, who's someone who persisted in academia. I'm sure you have stories like that, and they may become part of the mythology of your own families. People who work so hard. an immigrant 2 generations ago, a grandparent who struggled through tough times, maybe in the Depression. History is filled with examples. The history of technology growth in this country, for instance. If you've read the biography of Jobs, or you've thought about Apple as an organization, what is that? That's an organization, a company that's about persisting in the face of setback. Scientific research, and of course at Taft. How many of you, think about the examples at Taft of students who persist, and you see it everywhere in so many different venues. So it's everywhere. Now, I have one hero who persisted, and I'll take you through his story very quickly. And it'll give an example of what perseverance is. This is self-evident, but it says what you know, and he's an example of someone who overcame the challenges. It is natural not to persist. That's what this quote from Seligman and Peterson said. It's natural not to persist for those 2 reasons. It's really, really hard. And you get those blows to self-esteem. I don't want to keep trying and get knocked down again. That's really hard. And the second part that's hard is sometimes persisting is doing work that's intolerable. I was talking to someone out here who had a big, thick thing of note cards that they're studying. That's boring work, right? It's intolerable at times. And you think, I may do this and still not know the answer. But if you persist and keep over it, you can do it. And that last line is important. It is a learned skill. Taft is trying to teach you this. We're making it a very hard school because we think that you'll learn how to persist. Here's the story of a man who's a hero of mine, and it's a story that is maybe the greatest, one of the great stories about persistence. Shackleton was an early 20th century explorer. He was Irish and had a voyage that went to Antarctica that is unparalleled in history. I'm just curious, show of hands, anyone ever heard of him? Raise your hand if you've heard of Shackleton. Yeah, so maybe a third of you have heard. Shackleton had a goal. He, sorry about that. By this point, the South Pole had already been discovered. Norwegian explorer Amundsen had been there, had made it. Tragically, British explorer Robert Scott arrived 3 weeks later, just missed being the first to get there, and he and his 4 men froze to death on the way home in a terribly tragic expedition. This man, Shackleton, had been to the Antarctic twice. One time he had got very sick and had to actually be pulled out on a sled, which made him more determined. He came back another time, got within 94 miles of the South Pole, and then he came up with another idea. It's actually, if you think about it, it sounds crazy. The Trans-Antarctic expedition, he wanted to land somewhere in here. He was going to go across the continent, go by the South Pole, and go all the way across the continent. It was 1,800 miles. It would be like pulling a sled with food on it from New York to Denver. And he was convinced he could do it, and he probably would have been able to. It was a great voyage. The plans were huge. The whole world watched this, and it was a complete and utter failure. In every way, this failed, and yet it becomes one of the great stories ever of perseverance. Just to give you a sense of the geography, don't worry that you can't read this writing, but here's the tip of South America. Here's the continent of Antarctica. He sailed from here to this island, South Georgia Island, and they were going to sail in here. Unfortunately, what happened is they encountered ice in here, farther out than it had ever been seen before. The boat became trapped in the ice here. They had to live on the boat for about 10 months as it froze solid and drifted in the ice. The boat then became crushed. They were left on the ice for another several months. They drifted until the ice broke up. They had 3 small boats. They sailed these boats and rowed these boats to this island, and then he took one boat and sailed 800 miles to this island to get help. If you want an example of perseverance and setback, there's no greater one. So this gives you a sense again. You can see the voyage that happened here. Comes in here, gets stuck in the ice. The boat ends up getting crushed, and they leave the ice and then sail across. So let's look at what it looks like. You can see it here. There's South America. Here's the Antarctic that they're trying to get to. They never reached. We know this because they had a photographer. And Frank Hurley was the photographer for the expedition. If you're a photographer in the school, you should know about this man. Despite the fact that the expedition almost died several times, Shackleton allowed him to keep his camera. He allowed him to keep some pictures. They knew that if we maybe survive, this will become a great story in history. He took pictures throughout the expedition. You can see him here. That's really wanting to get a good shot. Climbing up onto the mast and out on the boom and then taking a picture of the boat. Here's the first part of it. So that's the boat. That's the Endurance, the name of the boat. They set sail, and you can see it's pretty rough conditions. They had 60 dogs on the boat. The dogs are going to help pull the sleds. They took about 1,000 pounds of whale meat. They hung it up on a spike, and they'd cut off pieces of meat every day for the dogs. It was really tough conditions. Here's the crew, 28 men, all headed towards Antarctica, Shackleton in the middle. And here they are encountering the ice hundreds of miles before they even got to the shore. At first, they could break through the ice. This boat was 2 feet thick in the bow, so it could crush through the ice. But as they went further and further in, they kept looking for leads, cracks in the ice, and they kept closing off. And ultimately, as one writer said, we were stuck like an almond in a chocolate bar. They were frozen in, and they began what I like to think of as sort of a winter term. They were on the boat for about 10 months. It's a lot like what we face. Here again, now they've gotten down to here. So here's the boat frozen in. They weren't panicked. Shackleton knew that they had a lot of food on there, and if they had to, and think about what he said, oh, it's okay, we'll live on this boat for 10 months. Thousands of miles from help, he said, we'll do this. There they are frozen. He chose people like this. This is Thomas Crean, who took care of all the dogs. He was interested in men they weren't military in training. He wanted optimists. He wanted people with unique skills and talents. One man said in the interview, I play banjo and I like to sing. He said, you're hired. He knew that you'd need people who could make the days go by. They were strong, resilient. They were the kind of people who would persevere. They tried to cut themselves free at one point. Here you can see them sawing through the ice. They used dynamite and tried to. A couple days after this picture, they came into ice that was 12 feet thick, and they said, we'll never be able to get out. And they were stuck forever. This is one of their 3 lifeboats that you'll hear about in a second. So there they were, frozen in. The polar night descended upon them. There's no sun. And this is where they were going to live for the rest of the year. The hope was when spring comes, maybe the ice will break up and we'll be able to sail home and be safe. Some of the men had singles. This is Shackleton's cabin. You can get a sense for the size of it. He had his books. He had his typewriter. When the pond froze over, they went out on it and played. This has got to be a record for the most extreme soccer game ever played. I love the fact that they even put the corner flag. Like who cares if you go out of bounds? You know? They did team photos. They bunked their beds so they had more room in the dorm rooms. They decorated them with pictures and tapestries. There's his typewriter. They had sit-down dinners. There's the waiter. They had after-dinner jobs. So you guys think you have it tough, right? And Shackleton, by the way, was really strong. He said, we need to have rituals. We've got to work. We've got to stay busy. They went to the jig. Look at that. I mean, what trip? What does it say about a leader that he remembers we need to bring some little pool tables? They exchanged playlists. So this guy, that's Frank Wild, the number 2 in command. And I guess he said, okay, let's all come in. We'll play some music and sing songs and listen to things. They had homework. He gave them assignments, especially the scientists on the expedition, and made them do work, take water samples, did autopsies of animals to learn more about them. And they were going to be okay. The problem was this. A boat gets stuck in the ice. Ice is not static. Ice has hundreds of miles of wind and pressure pushing it. And so for about 9 months, they were safely ensconced in here. You can imagine, though, the optimism they had to have, the perseverance to get through that. And then a gale swept over them, a hurricane, really, and the boat began to explode. They could hear beams snapping and cracking. They could hear the boat groaning. And so Shackleton said, we have to take to the ice. We have to live on the ice now. And things went from this to that, and then to that. And here's Frank Wild watching, and a week later, the boat just disappeared under the ice. So the ice was like giant jaws that just crushed the building. And you can imagine the terror they must have felt. It's one thing to be in the home, which the boat was, and it's another to realize that this is how we're going to live now. And so they had to live on the ice. And they set up camp. They called it Camp Patience. And they had enough food, but barely. They hunted seals in order to be able to make it, and the occasional penguin. And they had the food that was on the ship. But it was terribly boring. It was terribly dangerous. And over time, the ice began to break up. and the floe that they were on got smaller and smaller and smaller. Their only hope was they had 3 boats, 22 feet. They would easily fit on this platform here, 22 feet there were 3 of them. They tried to drag the boats to water, but they were so heavy they couldn't do it. And essentially he said, we've just got to wait, and maybe it'll break up. And ultimately, the ice broke up. And when it broke up, he said, everybody into the boats. And they said, we have to somehow get to land. And they sailed, and we have no pictures of this, obviously, because for 6 days in the worst ocean in the world, these men bailed and rowed and sailed in horrible conditions. Freezing, terribly painful, no hot food, barely anything to eat. And the only picture we have is this one. Well, this one. This is where they landed on Elephant Island. It was the first land that they had been on in 497 days. It's amazing when you think of what they went through. For 6 days they were on this boat. The only casualty of the trip, no one died, and I think it has to be this man here. There was a 19-year-old who joined the expedition, and his feet became frostbitten from sitting for 6 days in icy water in the bottom of his boat. He had to be carried ashore, and I think that must be young Justin Blackman who came on as the men pulled the boats up. First thing they did, I mean, look at was get out the stoves and make some hot milk. You can imagine the relief they felt when they finally had some fresh water. They could break off chunks of ice and they could drink fresh water. They turned the boats upside down. They put rocks underneath them to make a home. Again, the persistence and the resourcefulness to do this. But they couldn't live there for too long. Obviously, this Elephant Island is terribly uninhabitable. And Shackleton knew, I will leave these men, but I have to go save them. And so it's almost a comic. I mean, the difficulties thrown his way. So he said to the men, I'm going to take 5 of us, we're going to take a boat, and we're going to sail, and we're going to try to go 800 miles, and we're going to try to get to another island. This is the boat that they went on. You can see they've nailed some boards across the top to try to keep the water out, and they sailed in what is the most dangerous seas in the world. You might say, why didn't they, if they're at Elephant Island, why not just go this way to South America? That's Cape Horn. It's the worst ocean in the world. Seas average about 40 feet here. And they tried to, and they tried going this direction. They kept getting swept, and finally he said, we're going to have to go to South Georgia, where we all started. There is a whaling station there. There is some civilization. It was, most people say, the greatest open boat voyage in the history of mankind that we know of. 800 miles. At one point, they came across a wave that was 70 feet high, almost capsized, and using just a sextant, which was very primitive technology, the captain on the boat with him found South Georgia Island, and they arrived there, and you think, that's great. They've made it. They didn't make it. Because when they got there, they couldn't get around to the other side of the island because the boat was falling apart. And it's a mountainous island, and Shackleton said, you know what I'm going to have to do? I'm going to take 2 of you, and we're going to hike across the middle of this mountain, the middle of this island. By the way, they're 10,000-foot peaks. They took screws, they screwed them into their boats. He had 1 axe, he had 50 feet of rope. To give you a sense, that's what the island looks like. I mean, it's comic. What else is going to be thrown at them? This is from an airplane. That's that you get a sense of the topography that he had to cross. There it is again. That's where they landed, and that's what he said we have to hike across. He took the 3 men. They put the screws in the boots. They had 50 feet of rope. They had this axe, and they started climbing. And he took the greatest chance of all. He said, we're going light. We're basically bringing no food. We're making a dash across the island, and if we can make it, we will. And if we can't, we're going to die on this mountain. At one point, they were up high. They were freezing to death. They knew they had to get down, and he said, I felt a presence. We have to get down. It'll take us 6 hours to get down, or we can slide down. And they got on a mountain like this, and the men they lay on their backs, and they just put their hands in fate and God and slid down 6,000 feet to get down to safety. 6,000 feet. And here's how the voyage ends. He got across the mountain, found the whaling station, and said, can we get a boat to go save my men? So they went around the side of the island, got the men, and then they sailed the 800 miles in this boat back to South Georgia Island to rescue the rest of them. And here they are being rescued. In my family, it's a joke. They say, Dad, you're obsessed with Shackleton. Well, it's not a bad guy to be obsessed with. It's a great story about perseverance. What do we learn? I just would say these few takeaways and take them into the exams and the winter term with you. Obvious. Have a positive attitude. It's going to be a hard week. Have a good attitude. You will get through it. Be resourceful. Think of different ways to study. Think of different ways to approach the material. Remember what Shackleton's voyage told us. Human bonds matter. Your roommate matters. Your teachers matter. The other kids in the class matter. Inspire each other to persist. This one is what Shackleton believed. Setback is opportunity. I don't care what happens at Taft for you. If you see a setback, see it as opportunity. If you get cut from a team, if you didn't get the lead, if you got a low grade, see that not as setback, but see it as opportunity. And then the most important thing, just remember, perseverance will take you a long way. Shackleton ended up dying in 1922, was buried on South Georgia Island where his heart really was. And I think if he said anything to us, it would be that one simple word, persevere. Good luck. Okay.